Hi everyone, Cole here. It's time for another episode of Questions for Cole, our 19th episode. This week I would say that with our two questions, we reach to both extremes of serious questions versus not so serious questions. Let's start with the serious one. I received a great question a week or so ago. Let me read it to you. Today I read the book of Revelation, and wow, what a vision John had. I'm curious to know how you and some of your peers analyze this book. Can you take it seriously? Surely not literally. Do we need more background to interpret it? Have some of those things happened? Famines, the world wars, racial divides, and so on? I know it's a hard book to understand, but I feel it's becoming more relevant for us. Are we in the last days? I told you it was serious. First of all, no, we are not in the last days, in my opinion. Ask me again in a couple months. People have been predicting the end of the world for centuries. Often it's based on some misinterpretation of the apocalyptic literature that we find in Scripture. More on that in a minute. I saw something interesting the other day about how some people thought that the world was ending about 100 years ago or so, during the time of the Spanish flu. In fact, there was even a song written about it, an old blues-style song written by Blind Willie Johnson. It was called Jesus is Coming Soon. Listen to some of the lyrics. In the year of 19 and 18, God sent a mighty disease. It killed many a thousand on land and on the seas. The chorus is, well, we done told you, God's done warned you, Jesus is coming soon. A couple more verses that I want to share with you from that song. Great disease was mighty, and the people were sick everywhere. It was an epidemic, it floated through the air. Well, God is warning the nation, He's warning them every way, to turn away from the evil and seek the Lord and pray. While the nobles said to the people, you better close your public schools. Until the events of death has ended, you better close your churches too. And the very last verse, read the book of Zechariah. Bible plainly say, thousands of people they did die on account of their wicked ways. That was part of Jesus is Coming Soon by Blind Willie Johnson, written sometime around the Spanish flu outbreak. Sounds like it could have been written today, doesn't it? Hopefully we don't believe that God is sending this virus to us. I don't believe that. Certainly not to punish the wicked, although many people have believed that about illness and tragedy and other disasters down through the ages. But that's just not true at all. Willie was wrong about that, wrong about Jesus coming soon, too. But all of this does raise some interesting questions about the Bible, especially the kind of writing that we find in Revelation and elsewhere, the kind that talk about the end times. The Bible has quite a bit to say about this theme, because it was expected by many people and by some of the biblical authors that God would act to put an end to suffering and misery. It was expected that God would send a Messiah to rid the world of evil once and for all. That hope for some future day of reckoning was translated into scripture by the authors of Ezekiel, Daniel, Revelation, and others. Revelation was a sign of hope for many Christians in the first and second centuries, a time when Christians were being persecuted, being put to death for their beliefs. There was an incredible longing for God to come and put an end to all of this wickedness. How could such evil be happening so soon after the life of Jesus, when there was such hope for the world? How could such atrocities be permitted? Surely there would be an end to this. Surely the righteous would be victorious. So the author of Revelation, John of Patmos, believed with all his heart that God would come and give glory to the saints, to the martyrs, to all those who were living and dying for their beliefs. He had visions of such a day, and he wrote down those hopes and dreams in what we call the Revelation of John. I'll preach a whole sermon on this one of these days, but let me just say a bit about the book of Revelation today. John wrote that book in the form of apocalyptic literature, which was a form of writing that was very popular in the years just prior to and just following the death of Christ. This type of writing used symbolism, numbers, signs, visions, all sorts of strange and wonderful images to show what was happening in the world and what might happen in the future if things continued on the way they were going. In short, apocalyptic literature was meant to give readers a glimpse into the eternal and to warn them of what that might be like. But remember, it was always only one person's vision of what eternity may hold. The initial readers of Revelation would have read it very differently than we read it today, or at least that should be the case. From the point of view of 21st century biblical scholarship, Revelation should be for us an interesting look back at a certain kind of literature written for a specific group of people at a very difficult time in their history. It should not strike fear into our hearts about the end of time, nor should it lead us on a wild goose chase looking in the text for hidden meanings about current events. It should give us pause to consider what evils we do face in our time, but it should not lead us to believe in a vengeful God whose wrath is about to come upon us. The specifics of the book of Revelation have to do with the very specific details of what was happening to the Christians of that time, of John's time. And his readers would have recognized the symbolism and the imagery so much more readily than we ever could. I want to give you just one example of the meaning of the strange imagery to show you what I mean. John talks in chapter 13 about a terrible beast, the beast with the 7 heads, one of which had received a mortal wound but was healed. Now that imagery obviously means very little to us in our 21st century lives. But to John's readers, it would have been quite clear. The beast represented the Roman emperors, both living and dead, that they were to worship. They were forced to worship instead of worshiping God. 7 heads represented the 7 emperors who had instigated the worst of the Christian persecutions. And the one head that had been healed of a mortal wound symbolized the legend of the infamous Emperor Nero. The ruling Romans believed, or at least circulated the belief, that Nero, who had died many years before, would come back to life to once again lead a terrible army against his foes. That is one example of how confusing Revelation can be to us when we don't know the background, but how clear it would have been to those who understood both the symbolism and the style of writing. Now, some of the things that the book of Revelation talks about, some of the calamities that are predicted to happen in the future, have happened, sure. Things like war and disease and other things that happen all the time, over and over again through our history. But we are not reading the book correctly if we think that it's some kind of code that will tell us when the world will end. It's not that, and it never was. It was a symbolic book about the terrible things that were happening then, along with a hope that God would somehow bring the people's suffering to an end in some dramatic way. Often the writing included the second coming of Christ, which some Christians still believe will happen the way Revelation predicts, but many other Christians do not. And most of us see this writing for what it actually is, a symbolism meant to give a message to people who are enduring difficult times. So is it the end of the world? No, not literally. It might seem like it right now with all that is going on in the world, but it isn't. We can decide to live in fear based on what we see happening around us, or we can decide to live the way God has always called us to live, in hope and with purpose, continuing to live into our calling, to live out the gospel and to follow the Prince of Peace in how he lived his life, how he treated others, the message of hope that he gave to people who seemed to have no hope. That's still our calling today. And there are many, many good news stories all around us if we choose to seek them out and to focus on them and to join in, become a part of them. So I encourage all of you to do just that. If we do, and if we encourage each other and support each other, we can help refocus both ourselves and those around us with a new sense of optimism for the possibilities that still lay ahead of us. We shouldn't need the scare of an end times scenario. We shouldn't need the fear of a judgment day in order to make us do the work of Christ here and now. What we need for that we already have. The story of Christ from birth to death to resurrection, and all the hope that comes with that story. Okay, that was the first question. Thank you for that one. Now, moving on to our second question, which is not quite as serious, I think you'll agree, or as deep as that first one. This comes from one of our congregation members who does like to give me a hard time once in a while. I will read it to you. Hey Cole, question for you. Why do you use matches to light the candles every Sunday? Is it symbolic, or are you just too cheap to buy a butane candle lighter that is made for exactly that purpose and much safer? Every time I see you do that, I'm afraid you're going to burn yourself or burn your house down. Well, first of all, thanks for your concern. Second of all, I am a little bit cheap, I'll admit that, and I do have a huge box of matches that I'll never use up even if I light the candles for 10 more years worth of online services, God forbid. But let me see how best to answer this question. You know, I rarely rely on the "what would Jesus do" line, but this might be a perfect time for it. So let me ask you, what would Jesus do? How would Jesus have lit a candle back in the day? Butane barbecue lighter? I don't think so. Actually, he wouldn't have used matches either, since they wouldn't have been invented until hundreds of years later. The Bible mentions oil lamps and torches, which would make burning down my house even more likely, I imagine. So the best answer is that I like using matches. And I've seen too many very awkward moments during church services where people are trying to light candles with one of those lighters when they are out of fuel, or maybe they just don't know that you have to hold the button down to keep the flame alight. I'm sure you've all experienced this. The person is holding up the lighter and they click the button. Nothing happens. They click it again and again and again. Click, 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 click. I'm sticking with matches. Thank you very much for the question. And that's it for this week. I hope you all have a wonderful week, and I hope you tune in for our online service on Sunday morning. Send your questions to cole@selkirkunitedchurch.ca. Take care, everyone, and God be with you.